Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the CSH. My name is Laurence Gauthier. I'm a historian here at the Centre de Sciences Humaines. It's my great pleasure this evening to welcome Professor Veena Naregal, who is Professor of Sociology at the Institute of Economic Growth in Delhi. Veena Naregal has a PhD in Cultural and Political History from SOAS, London. Her research interests span a very wide range of topics, including historical sociology, language politics, cultural politics, higher education, and more recently, labor. She published journal articles on a very wide range of topics, from Marathi, Sangeet Natak, and Bollywood to media distribution networks, colonial intellectuals, translation, bilingualism, and hierarchies of language and power in colonial India, or labor policy. Professor Naregal is also the author of a monograph entitled Language Politics, Elites and the Public Sphere, Western India Under Colonialism, which was published by Permanent Black in 2001. Her current work explores the intersections between marginalization and policy making. So her current research clusters around three main themes. First, mapping continuities across social policy domains for India from the 1940s to the present, with a special focus on informality and labor market dualism. Second, she looks at the history of modern economic thought in South Asia through the translations of economic treatises into Marathi in colonial Mumbai. And third, she looks at the connection between linguistic territorialization and developmental agendas between the 1920s and the 1960s. And I guess that it is this third aspect of her current research work that she will present today under the title Monolingual States in a Polyglot Setting, ? The Long History of Linguistic Territorial Reorganization in India, 1905 to the 1950s. To discuss her work this evening, we are delighted to welcome Professor Kalpana Kannabiran, who is a distinguished professor at the Council for Social Development in Hyderabad. Professor Kannabiran is with us online this evening. She's both a sociologist and a legal scholar whose work focuses on the intersections of constitutional studies, human rights, sociology, law, literature, gender studies, and social movements. She's a rights educator for communities in struggle and has worked closely with social movements and advocacy groups on initiatives for legal and constitutional literacy. Her most recent publications include a monograph entitled Law, Justice, and Human Rights in India, Short Reflections, which was published in 2021. She also recently edited the Routledge Readings on Law and Social Justice, as well as the Routledge Readings on Law Development and Legal Pluralism. Even more recently, she co-edited a compilation of selections from Telugu literature, which were translated into English under the title Voices of Resistance, Telugu Progressive Political Literature, which was published last year. It is our great pleasure to welcome both of you this evening. We will start this session with a presentation by Professor Naregal, followed by a discussion by Professor Kannabiran.
And thank you so much, Lawrence. Thank you, CSH, for this invitation to present. And thank you, Kalpana, for being the discussant. Great, yeah. So let me dive in straight away. As Lawrence said, this is work on the long history of territorial reorganization. I'm just trying to move the slides, yeah. I'd like to, this is actually a fairly long paper, and I don't think there's going to be time to go into the entire paper. I've sort of outlined the main questions that kind of, made it necessary for me to write this paper. And I also talk about the overall structure of the paper, and then I'll be able to highlight probably a section and a half of the actual paper. So let me sort of begin by posing a few observations on how the language question figures in public policy debates since independence. Question 1, within post-47 public and political debates, persistently the language question has largely figured as the medium of instruction issue. The report of the Official Languages Commission, for example, in the 1950s, noted that its basic assumption was that language was important only at the level of instrumentality and not of, actual intrinsic consequence. Given the subcontinent's multilingual diversity, such an instrumental significance to language seems profoundly incongruous, if not actually disturbing. So, the question is, how did we sort of come upon, the language issue being posed in such instrumentalist fashion? I have argued that such an instrumental framing of the language question in post-47 in public discourse is no mere coincidence. While the visible effects of this kind of a framing abound all around, the paring down of the language issues within higher education as a concern with translating pedagogic materials largely into Hindi. It's as though, English and Hindi are the two languages that count, and everything else is equally sort of unimportant, or sort of, for practical purposes off the map. And we can perhaps even speak of something of an elite consensus that to even raise the language question remains actually a sign of some kind of backwardness, right? So, but I mean, there are visible effects. There's this kind of a sort of signs of a pervasive elite consensus, and the consequences have had an enduring impact. So the second question is, to me, it's very striking that in stark contrast to the vigorous debates with respect to, Indian nationhood and democracy around markers such as caste, class, gender, and so on, how do we explain the critical reticence around the language question? Closer to them. Oh, okay. How do we actually sort of explain the critical reticence around the language question? The lack of critique of the Indian nation, citizenship, and so on in terms of language as a marker of difference, this lack is not even commented upon. Is this because the possibilities to frame the language issue as intrinsically related to the core issues of Indian democracy have been progressively disabled? Where, unto a point where, I mean, it's something of a blind spot. And what role does the unfortunate posing of the official link language debates in the Constituent Assembly as a choice as though just between English and Hindi? I mean, if you actually follow the Constituent Assembly debates, the debate is about, which would be your sort of official language, English or Hindi. And all the other regional languages are, treated as equally less important vis-a-vis the status of English and Hindi. So what role has that kind of opposing of the language issue had in this sort of progressive disabling of a possibility of critique of the, of nationhood, democracy, and so on in terms of language? Question 3. Typically, the reorganization of the Congress into linguistic units in the 1920 Nagpur Congress is said to explain the genesis of linguistic reorganization. The question that I want us to sort of consider today is, does this sort of a event signaled as this sort of key moment actually explain everything, as though, I mean, that's the kind of story that we are often told, that linguistic reorganization, the first thing we need to talk about is Nagpur Congress 1920, right? All narratives point to the first fronting of linguistic identity as a marker of territoriality at the Nagpur Congress 1920 as historic. It's usually presented as, as part of Gandhi's famous three-pronged initiative at the Nagpur Congress. And those three sort of main changes that he brings to the Congress Creed, the change of the Congress Creed, the introduction of non-cooperation as a principle of sort of opposition, and the reorganization of Congress, of the Congress provincial structure along linguistic lines. And, sort of tying all this together, there is a new Congress constitution passed and sort of adopted in 1920. It's very odd that, these three things sort of all happening at the same time, at the very moment that Gandhi kind of steps into the Congress as its leader. I mean, this is his first move. And, this comes like as really a package of changes that he brings in. And yet these are rarely linked by asking, why is it that Gandhi brings in all the three resolutions in one go? What does their being clubbed together actually signify? Importantly, and we have Ambedkar to thank for having emphasized the need to actually see these three moves by Gandhi as linked and needing to be read together. Their importance as, the way conventional sort of accounts flag the 1920 Nagpur Congress, they basically sort of, take their importance as described within the Indian National Congress self-narratives at face value, right? They're sort of seen to be part of Gandhi's magic formula to transform the Congress, from something of a slumbering giant that was, they were, Congress prior to 1920 were more or less content with periodic petitions and endless sort of internal wrangling. I mean, I'm deliberately making a caricature of it, but just to sort of give you the sort of before and after type of contrast, to a party of mass action. And when we buy into this narrative, we fail to question several things. Among them, this kind of a direct identification between region and its linguistic identity to create linguistic states in a federal structure. I mean, it's almost assumed that there's some kind of an automatic kind of connection between linguistic boundaries and the federal structure. I mean, that's Indian states needed to be along, there's an inevitability sort of, that to date has not been questioned. How is it that the linguistic marker actually came to be privileged as the marker chosen to kind of identify the sort of boundary lines in the federal sort of structure? What were the processes? What were the reasons? And, what were the stages through which this actually proceeded? And even more importantly, perhaps, the implications of this kind of a sort of identification between region and a linguistic identity, right? This happens in, this is a radical move, especially in a polyglot polity, where there is immense linguistic diversity. And the indexing of linguistic difference as a territorial category within this kind of a polyglot polity is something that really needs to be sort of questioned and understood quite, quite sort of fundamentally. And really that process has not sort of, we are yet to sort of see the beginnings of that process. To date, the creation of linguistic states are simply hailed within official political discourse as, this is about strengthening Indian democracy. Well, this is what, the Congress said. This is what the States Reorganization Commission report said. This is what various people have said when they wanted to kind of, pose this as the real sort of, as the claimed reason. And this is what we have chosen to accept. That's where our understanding really, it hasn't gone beyond that. Going back to Ambedkar's remarks on the 1920 Nagpur Congress, and mindful of his insight, I'm arguing here for the importance to decenter territorialization of linguistic identity beyond conventional narratives built around the 1920 moment. And I'm arguing for the need to focus on important political shifts in the late colonial period, specifically in the years after the Bengal Partition onwards, moving on through the interwar years and the 30s up to the 50s. So that's how I kind of, have tried to sort of think of a long history of territorial reorganization. So essentially, we need to sort of, think of more complex analysis than that are available in the self-narratives of the Congress. Now, another key question is, if the privileging of language issues, within the federal imagination happened in 1920, how did this simultaneously over time actually leave us with this kind of an instrumentalist sort of an understanding of the language, the significance of the language issue? If 1920, the claim was this was to strengthen the Congress and the sort of national movement and eventually democracy, where did that kind of belief that language is of no real internal, sort of major import, where does that come from? And in the 1940s, the late 40s, after partition, the Dar Commission, for example, and the Congress leadership, and all the sort of, there is a sort of decision at the national level of the inherent divisiveness of linguistic boundaries. The Dar Commission is constantly sort of, warning of the risks and the dangers of linguism. It's spoken of in extremely pejorative terms, right? And this kind of understanding of the mere instrumentality of linguistic identity that, we sort of saw reflected in the report of the Official Languages Commission. Can any of this be treated as inevitable? Or do we need to kind of begin doing the work of historians by emphasizing framing and finding connections in the contingency of events? And obviously, that's a rhetorical question. I'm trying to say that this paper, in its entirety, is an attempt to kind of doing that. And if that's one kind of puzzle, the last puzzle that I want to sort of point your attention to before getting into the actual sort of account, how do we explain the long gap between 1920 and 1960, between when the Congress actually accepts the logic of linguistic provinces and when linguistic reorganization actually happens? How do we explain this protracted process? Are we to assume that the Congress simply developed cold feet, or is the answer more complex? So as emphasized earlier, I think it's absolutely necessary to think of a long history of linguistic organization that can be traced onward from 1905, the Bengal Partition, the opposition to the Bengal Partition, and the kinds of moves that are kind of, seen as a solution to the kind of opposition that the Bengal Partition actually meets with, and the revocation of the Bengal Partition. And what does this sort of episode, so to speak, actually, what are the signals that it then sends out to other kinds of regional language movements that have already been sort of, that have shown significant signs of mobilization through the late 19th century, right? So, what I'm basically arguing is the regional as a category evolves within the South Asian modern political imagination through very distinct processes over a fairly sort of long period of time, from the Bengal Partition 1905 to the 1950s, and I sort of, for the purposes of this paper, more or less draw the line at at 1960 when the, a linguistic reorganization actually is formally announced. Uh, so when it comes to this sort of protracted history, I think two aspects of this story need to be recognized as of fundamental consequence. Provincial reorganization on linguistic lines was implicitly about determining how the several markers of social difference and hierarchies in the Indian setting, I mean, several markers, caste, religion, language, and so on, how, these would be sort of balanced and coded into the sort of structures of political representation that are getting sort of, you know, co contested, sort of, envisaged and getting formalized as constitutional categories, right? So, I mean, it is in this kind of a scenario of contestation between the significance and the value of various markers that language sort of presents itself as some kind of a neutral ground, right? I'm hoping the argument will also come out in the sort of the parts of the paper that I present. But overall, that's the claim that the paper is making. And so if that is one aspect of the story that needs to be recognized as fundamentally important, the second is that, this kind of an extended or a staggered temporality that I referred to, through which linguistic territorialization actually gets advanced between 1920 and 1960, meant that this process of sort of advancing the logic of linguistic territorialization actually intersected with the embracing of developmental agendas in the same period. It's the 1930s onwards that, you have development as a goal of the nationalist movement, being formally adopted within the Congress. There are sort of structures being put in place. It becomes part of, the objective of, a core objective of the national movement, the provincial ministries and all of that. And so, there's a way in which this kind of a redrawing of the federal map in terms of the linguistic provinces, that whole process actually intersects. And this kind of an interweaving of these dual logics, I think it's kind of important to keep that in mind. And obviously a paper cannot do that exhaustively. But what I'm trying to basically suggest here is that sort of weaving of those two logics is extremely important to kind of, highlight as central to understanding why perhaps it took 40 years. There were, this gets flagged in 1920, development gets sort of adopted as a goal in the 1930s. 1940s, the Dar Commission is saying, several steps back, linguism, highly sort of dangerous, not to be touched, etc., etc. And then gradually, there is the battle for Bombay where there, Nehru and the Congress High Command are extremely sort of reluctant to allow Bombay to actually be given to monolingual Maharashtra. And the Congress needs to be sort of, the Congress leadership needs to be sort of convinced that, granting and ceding this demand will actually not affect business interests and so on and so forth. It finally happens, when Mrs. Gandhi is more active on the scene. She is already information and broadcasting minister. That's a story that, kind of gets into the sort of, the details of it, which we won't have time for, and the paper doesn't even look at all of that. But, I'm basically trying to sort of, help you make sense of what I mean by this sort of interweaving and this sort of dual logic that's getting advanced, and how there's like, it's like, the two things need, need to be sort of brought together and aligned before linguistic reorganization is thought to be sort of safe enough and not interfere with the sort of other kinds of agendas that have gained priority, right? Um, so, where are we? Okay. Um, let me just quickly flag the three main sections in the overall paper. The first deals with the Bengal Partition, the administrative reforms, and the idea of sort of linguistic regions, how that takes root. The second looks at the period, the interwar period up to say 1947, and it's during this phase in 1928 that you have the first articulation of linguistic provinces. 1920, the Congress was talking about its sort of units, the units within the Congress. Here, the 1928 Motilal Nehru report, also regarded as the first draft of the Indian Constitution, is for the first time sort of mentioning linguistic provinces as desirable and the accepted sort of way to organize the federal structure. And alongside during this phase, you also have the expansion of the university network in the interwar periods, and I trace it to 1947. So within this, that is the section, this section that I'm actually sort of going to focus on in the time available to me over here. So I look at three things: the period between the Lucknow Pact at 1916 to the Nehru Report 1928, where you have the legitimization of linguistic provinces in 1928. And if you you will recall that the Lucknow Pact had actually sort of was the first and the only time that the Congress had actually agreed to communal electorates, right? So 1960, the Congress had been party to a formal sort of pact signed between Tilak and Jinnah, the Muslim League and the Congress, right? Where the Congress had accepted the principle of communal electorates. And in 1928, the Congress is not even mentioning the Lucknow Pact, although the Nehru Report 1928, that meeting also happens in Lucknow. And the contemporary press actually even talks about it as the second Lucknow Pact, right? If you look at the sort of records of the time, the parallels are clearly there, and yet this kind of there's literally sort of an erasure and of a completely new kind of direction that the Nehru Report is taking. So we really need to kind of look at and understand the legitimization of linguistic provinces in 1928 in relation to what it says about communal electorates and the reasons why communal electorates actually kind of get jettisoned soon after 1916, actually. I'll say a bit more about that. But by 1928, it's really sort of coded into what is going to be the vision of what gets taken as the draft constitution, right? And as I said, the reintroduction, this is also the time when for the first time after a lapse of about 6 decades, the vernaculars are reintroduced into the university curricula after 1919 onwards. After 1857, the colonial government basically sort of, is of the view that, the presence of vernacular sort of education at the higher classes level was kind of actually allowing, larger sections of the intelligentsia to become aware, and it was feeding into sort of political dissent and turmoil. And one of the first things that happens after 1857 is, I mean, the option to sort of major or study the Indian languages in Elphinstone College, for example. I mean, the material I look at is mainly Western India. So Elphinstone College, students can no longer study the regional languages at the college level. Only the first batch graduating in 1863, Ranade is one of the first graduates of Bombay University. I mean, it's just that first batch that has that sort of option. And after that, I mean, the only options that students had was to study the classical languages. It could be Hebrew, it could be Farsi, it could be Arabic, it could be Greek, Latin, etc., Sanskrit, but not the vernacular languages, right? So if that was the 1860s, it's only in 1919 that the vernaculars are allowed to sort of return, so to speak, into university curricula, but under very sort of stringent conditions and very constrained circumstances, which I will elaborate. And it's also significant that through this period, there's a big shift that you see between the 1920s and 1940s. Regional elites in Western India, the same people who had kind of in the 1920s, who were sort of, giving minutes of dissent to the committee for the commission for the reform of Bombay University in 1924. Mukund Jaikar, Gadgil. Gadgil was, of course, not a member of the committee. He kind of gives a sort of elaborate, I mean, there are many sort of people who actually give in their testimonies. There were questionnaires and so on. I mean, opinions were systematically collected. Ambedkar also gives his views. So all the sort of Pune elites who had spoken in favor of a university in Pune which would have instruction on regional histories, on sort of, region subjects to do with the region. In other words, sort of actually advance repertoires of regional knowledge through the use of Marathi. I mean, this was what regional elites were arguing for in 1920. And by the 1940s, all of them now, I mean, Gadgil is actually a member of another of the actual committee that talks about the establishment of Pune University. So it's, that's again is a process that takes, I mean, several years. The idea is accepted in the 20s that the university system in Western India will kind of get expanded beyond Bombay. The demand was for universities in Sindh, in Gujarat, in Pune, I mean, at least one new university in each of these sort of segments of the Bombay presidency. But the 1924 committee actually says that they would accept only the demand for Pune. I mean, in principle, it's kind of conceded, but there is no sort of either discussion or acceptance of the demand that it will be sort of a regional language university. All of that is kind of, I mean, basically sort of pushed under the table, and it is, the report simply says that, these are issues that will be looked into as and when the university will decide. The university itself, I'm sure, is competent to kind of take care of these issues when the matters become relevant and so on and so forth. So basically, those issues are completely sort of deferred and are removed, so to speak, from the agenda of sort of, the pan-Indian level. And it's significant that Jaikar, Gadgil, and all these people, Jaikar becomes the first vice chancellor of Pune University in 1948. But the report that he actually submits as chairperson before that, is agreeing that, I mean, they looked very carefully into the question of the medium of instruction, but they think, this was one of the most difficult things that they had to look into. And the final recommendation is that, there are so many reasons why it cannot be Marathi. It has to be English, right? And these are the people who sort of, Jaikar, Gadgil, all of these people actually sign off on that report. So, I mean, that story is sort of extremely sort of crucial to kind of understanding the terms on which linguistic reorganization actually happens, right? So if language movements were, there was a certain kind of democratizing stimulus to the language movements in the late 19th century, right? By the time linguistic reorganization happens, much of that sort of radical impetus has been, I mean, contained, domesticated, has been, I mean, there were clear reasons why language was actually chosen as the sort of marker, right? And given that, I mean, the kind of, the terms on which language is then kind of becomes part of the federal structure, is that vision is very, very different from what, the open-ended kind of possibilities that people active in the language movement in the 1890s were actually sort of envisaging. I mean, if you think about it, language is one marker that allows for an open-ended imagination of community, unlike caste, religion, or any of these sort of identity markers, which you are born into. There was, I mean, the energy behind the language movements in the late 19th century, I think, can be only understood when you kind of see the difference between, I mean, what mobilization along linguistic lines, I mean, the possibility that it seemed to kind of open up. So I mean, it's a very different vision by the 1960s. By the time you have linguistic states in 1960. So that kind of a contrast between what I call for the period between 1945 to 1950s, I see as the tension between the regional federalists and the developmentalist federalism. I mean, that's a part of the paper that I don't think there's going to be time for here, but people who are interested, I mean, we may be able to sort of touch on this in the discussion, or, I mean, I'm happy to share the paper as well. Okay. So I'm going to basically, I mean, just say a few things about section 1, and then basically go on to elaborating on the Lucknow Pact and the Nehru Report. I mean, that contrast. So I mean, the Bengal Partition, what I do in the first section really is to highlight how, I mean, it was the need for administrative reform that led to, all these sort of steps towards territorial redistribution. And that was the thinking behind the Bengal Partition as well, right? And it was at this time that linguistic identity and territorial redistribution intersected with competing mobilizations, right? There were all kinds of alternative claims being put forth. And through this phase, the impact that the mobilization of Bengali public opinion against the partition of Bengal, served as a great impetus towards assertions of regional nationality and administrative political autonomy within colonial India. The earliest campaigns along lines of regional unity were advanced by emerging nationalities that saw themselves as neglected within the presidency structure. So you had the Biharis and the Odias within Bengal presidency, and the Andhras in Madras presidency sort of making the first kind of moves towards, I mean, assertions on linguistic lines. I'm going to skip this, and basically what this slide is saying is, the idea is to kind of bring in administrative reform. Language seems like a good way to kind of demarcate provinces, uh, because it actually allows you to kind of balance it with ceding minimum political control. This is what Hardinge is in his speech as Viceroy at the Delhi Darbar, 1911, where the separation of Bihar from Bengal presidency is actually announced. It's actually announced at the Delhi Darbar. So that's the first linguistic sort of province that you have in colonial India, Bihar. And at that point, Hardinge is saying, I mean, this is going to be the direction in which our, territorial redistribution is going to take, and it throws open the possibility for the least kind of damage to our interests, right? Uh, okay, so yeah, let me just say a little more about the Lucknow Pact and the Nehru Report, which is basically part of the second section. Prior to 1920, basically the Congress had been organized into 6 constituent circles. And after 1920, there were 21 provincial committees along linguistic lines. Now, I have the text of the resolution, an important resolution that gets passed at the Congress in 1920. And the reason I have it there is to actually highlight what's at the end of the quote there. The idea of sort of, I mean, by now, the idea of minorities and majorities. The idea that, numbers matter in terms of making representative claims. That is clearly entrenched within the way sort of affairs are being, and, I mean, agendas are being kind of advanced within the Congress. And so basically, these resolutions are being passed with the president of the Congress going from section to section, asking people to put up their hands and saying how each of those resolutions are actually sort of passed by an overwhelming majority. Now, this again gives an idea of how many people actually voted for these resolutions in each of the new provinces. So it's interesting that the structure has been sort of modified, and the new resolutions are already being sort of passed by the new sort of structure that was proposed, right? So now, I mean, if you kind of think of how radical a shift this was with respect to what had been put in place just a few years ago in the Lucknow Pact. For the first time in Lucknow, 1916, the Congress had explicitly conceded the principle of communal representation. There were separate electorates for Muslims from 1909 onwards, but at that point, the Congress had been fairly resentful about this. But there was a formal agreement that gets reached in 1916, led, I mean, Tilak and Jinha are hailed as, for signing the Lucknow Pact. And the Congress itself saw itself as doing this on behalf of, of the entire sort of Indian nation, so they're clearly sort of party to it. So essentially, the Lucknow Pact allows for, certain kind of, levels of reservations for of special seats to be sort of reserved for Muslims. I mean, there isn't really much time to go into the details of it, but in each of the provinces there are certain percentages, set percentages of all the elected members that will be elected by separate electorates. As against this, what the Nehru Report is trying to do is to legitimize linguistic provinces and delegitimize communal electorates, right? And I mean, looking at the structure of the Nehru report itself is interesting, because the second and third chapters are on communal electorates, and it's only in the final chapter that it actually comes up with its recommendations, where it actually says, communal representation is rejected, linguistic provinces are legitimized. So I talk about chapter 2 and how the arguments sort of actually are advanced. I'll skip over that, and yeah, and I'll just take another 2 or 3 minutes, and I'll stop there. I'll urge you to kind of just look at the very end of this quote. Separate electorates must therefore be discarded completely as a condition precedent to any rational system of representation. We can only have joint or mixed electorates. And on the left-hand side, just a couple of lines there. Everybody knows that separate electorates are bad for the growth of national spirit. But everybody perhaps does not realize equally well that separate electorates are still worse for a minority community. So there are various kind of reasons being given for the rejection of linguistic provinces. Now, so let me just say one more thing and stop. I think it's I mean, if we kind of put aside the slide for now, I'll only sort of make one major point, and I think that's it's important to kind of see the Nehru report as standing literally midway between the Lucknow Pact and the Pune Pact. What was the Lucknow Pact about? Separate electorates for Muslims. What was the Pune Pact about? Ambedkar is made to kind of give up the demand for separate electorates for Dalits, right? For the scheduled castes. Now, between these two kind of moments, you have the Nehru report. I mean, of course, it's only a draft constitution. It actually doesn't kind of get accepted. I mean, it just lapses the one year period that was sort of set, the deadline that was set. It doesn't get formally adopted within that year. So in that sense, it actually, formally does not even get formalized. But nevertheless, the thinking behind it is absolutely central to sort of, it's important to kind of recognize what this pattern is actually showing. So the delegitimization of separate electorates with respect to sort of minorities, with respect to sort of subaltern marginalized groups, and the legitimization of joint electorates as the basis on which structures of representation and claims of representation will be advanced. And it's to this that the acceptance of linguistic provinces is actually tied. Now, I kind of layer this with the other kinds of parts of the paper, where I the stuff that I talked about, the terms on which the vernaculars get are allowed to re-enter the university system and so on. And then what happens in the 1940s around the battle, from the 1940s onwards to the battle for Bombay in the 1950s. That's a separate part of the paper, which, I'm happy to kind of go into if there are questions. Thank you so much for allowing me a little extra time, Lawrence.
Thank you very much, Professor Naregal. I would like to ask now Professor Kanabiran, if you can please join us. Thank you. So the floor is yours for your comments and questions. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Lawrence. And thank you, Veena, for that, really rich presentation. I did read a draft of your paper, but as you were presenting it, there were just so many thoughts that just kept bursting out. I'm not sure that I will be able to cover all of them, but I think I will attempt to raise some, some interesting questions that arise that to a certain extent, have to do with the political trajectory you've traced in terms of the language issue, but also issues that, you know, no. Sorry, I just have a problem with the language. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So also some issues that, you know, come up as a tangent. The first point, of course, for me, the starting point is the point that Veena concludes with, which is on the question of representation, you know, where you see such a stark difference between, for instance, the Lucknow Pact and the Pune Pact on the one side, and the argument of linguistic homogeneity on the other. You know, and obviously these things are not separate, and they are very, very clearly interlocked, even historically, creating paradoxes as we go along. And that's a point that I will actually return to a little later. On the language movement itself, I think also interestingly, you know, when you talk about language, you know, language sitting over the idea of a region, you know, in the state that I originally belonged to, which has now been reorganized again on linguistic lines. Andhra Pradesh was one of the first states, of course, but you know, the linguistic reorganization happened on the body of a leader who fasted to death for a separate state, Potti Sriramulu. And you know, so and then again, you know, the movement for a separate Telangana is again a movement on the politics of language and culture, which language and culture closely tied to questions of land and territoriality. And it's again a movement that starts almost at the inception of the state of Andhra Pradesh, but finally comes to fruition in in the second decade of the 2000s. And so we are seeing it, you know, quite politically charged, and that's the, you know, that's a major point that I wanted to raise also in relation to Veena's talk, that this entire period that you're talking about from 1920s right up to 1950s and even 1960 is also a period that is politically charged. It is a period of immense literary production in different states, in different languages, in different regions. The idea of literary production in language, also the idea of the form and content of language, the move, for instance, in Telugu, clearly traced from the move from Grandhikam, or the formal ornate, to the Vyavaharika Bhasha, which is the spoken language as the language that must be used in as an academic medium, and so on, was a huge movement, which with several reformers actually focusing on the need to enrich language by broadening its spread through the spoken tongues of people. You also have in this period, for instance, you know, the translation, the creation of dictionaries. What came to my mind immediately was Gedugu Venkatramurthy's dictionary of Savara to English. So from an Adivasi language, between an Adivasi language and English. And so there was so much of ferment around language. And my question then, and so much of politics around language, that my question then was also, how does the administrative um, structure or the administrative apparatus deal with the politics, with anti-imperialist politics, with movements against empire, using the vernaculars in their multiplicity, while at the same time trying to put in place easily governable administrative units. What does that conversation between a politics constantly in the making and shaping and an administrative process do to each other? And just one, I had just one more question, which again has to do with is related to the question of representation that you ended with. And it is, after all, when you talk about language, whether we talk about writers like Chugtai and Jilani Banu or several other writers. I have these two because I've most recently read and reread works by them. Caste, gender, community, how are these inflected through language, which even within a particular language is organized in terms of a multiplicity. So you're talking about polyglot cultures at many levels, yeah. And the questions for me that are really important, particularly in the questions that your paper raises, are really important at this moment. And I think it's politically important for us to revisit these questions when we are fast moving towards the homogenization of not just, one nation, one election, one this and one that, but also one language for the entire nation, which is incomprehensible to most of us. So, what the turn in terms of, the governance, the languages of governance, you can look at the criminal major acts, I can't even pronounce their names anymore. How does that, how is one then to draw lessons from this history in order to understand how we might approach a politics of the present? Yeah, this was really my major takeaway from your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Kalpana. Thanks for the responses and for the questions. I'm not sure especially the second one. That's when I began doing this work, I was so convinced that it was important to kind of look at the Nehru report, because of the ways in which it kind of, showed me, the first moment when majoritarianism sort of gets kind of, the national movement kind of clearly becoming aware and legitimizing and sort of actually coding it into sort of its strategy of building national consensus and so on and so forth. That was why I sort of got drawn to reading the Nehru report so carefully and closely. And then I began to see all these, other kinds of patterns emerging. And of course, it's at one level, there was the excitement of being able to kind of see that. But on the other hand, sort of the sheer the pace, the furious pace at which contemporary developments were sort of actually, contemporary realities were changing, I mean, it was extremely disheartening to kind of, to realize that, that moment of insight, even before it can be even shared or thought about, I mean, in terms of where we were at 47 in 1960, 1980s, and the kinds of changes that come in with economic reforms and so on. I mean, how each of these junctures, the lack of sort of consensus and the use of, the bypassing of sort of democratic procedures that really, I mean, it's so visible in the Nehru report. I mean, it's actually very striking the way in which the argument for Sindh, for example, is accepted as, I mean, it's clearly a communal kind of demand. The demand for Sindh is mainly coming from the Muslims. There's a clear kind of division between the people who are opposing it and so on. But you have the Nehru report actually saying that, I mean, it kind of overlooks the communal aspect of it and says, this is the majority. And therefore, it's only in the fitness of things that we kind of accept Sindh. Now, I mean, these complexities, just as one sort of begins to flesh out, one sees the kinds of repercussions and the role these have played in the way dissent and so on have been managed in subsequent decades. And of course, I mean, the logic of majoritarianism, we know where it has got us presently. So, I mean, I basically see your second question as something that, I mean, obviously one doesn't have an answer to, but that canvas was very much on, in my mind as I was thinking about this research and actually writing this. But yeah, in terms of, drawing the parallels, or what lessons to be learned, I think that will have to be a much sort of longer conversation. I'll just say a couple of things about your other question. How does the administrative apparatus deal with anti-imperialist politics in the vernacular? And in the paper, I actually have parts where I talk about, I draw on Chimanlal Setalwad's kind of, speeches as the Vice Chancellor of Bombay University at the moment when the vernaculars are actually being readmitted into the university. And, what's interesting is that, I mean, the vernaculars at this point are admitted only as, for the study of literature, that they will have nothing to do with the chairs in political science, in the chair of, the chairs in civics and economics, and any of the social science departments that are actually being set up. So as a literary subject, and, I mean, as a former sort of student of English literature, this kind of, for me, it kind of also shows me the connections with the history of the institutionalization of English literary studies in late 19th century England and so on. So I mean, clearly this is seen as a way of managing the kind of space that the study of vernaculars in the universities will actually, how it will be managed and actually constrained. I'll just, I'll leave it for now at that, Kalpana. I mean, we should talk about this, separately as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Veena, and thank you very much, Kalpana, also for this session. I just wanted to briefly inform you that our next seminar will take place on the 8th April. Vidya Subramanian will present a talk entitled Channeling Compassion Towards Change, Elite Voluntarism, corporate philanthropy and education reform in urban India. Thank you very much again for your participation, and we look forward to meeting you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kalpana.
Thank you. Thanks, Veena.
Very much, Kalpana.
Yeah, thanks.